For me, sketchbooks are all about challenging myself and trying things I wouldn't otherwise. So what's more challenging than a palette that's completely opposite from my regular? In today's video, join me as I challenge myself by trying out the Zorn palette. I've been really enjoying trying out limited palettes lately. I will leave a playlist linked up above, and you can let me know down in the comments below if you have other ideas for limited palettes I should try. I would love to hear them. The Zorn palette is an extremely limited palette of 4 paints. It includes a bright red, either a cadmium red or an alizarin crimson, a muted yellow ochre, and then white and black. The brightest color is the red, obviously, but then there's no bright yellow, only a yellow ochre. Absolutely no blue, no green, no purple, anything in the cool gamut you basically don't have. So if you're familiar with me and my artwork, you might have figured out why this is a huge, intimidating challenge for me. If you're brand new and this is your first video here, hi, welcome to my studio. My name is Lee Angold. I am a botanical artist and natural science communicator. I paint a lot of green stuff. Mosses, lichens, crusty branches, forest ecosystems. On this channel, I bring you along on my explorations of the natural world and share watercolor techniques and tips along the way. If that's content that you're interested in, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. But oh yeah, watercolor. That's the other reason why the Zorn palette is really weird and intimidating to me. As a transparent watercolor artist, I'm not really used to using white or black in my paintings. For white, I tend to use the white of the paper, and my darkest darks, my blacks, I mix by mixing complementary colors across the color wheel. Oh, but I don't actually use a bright red much in my paintings at all, to the point where I leave it out of my palettes. Don't believe me? I actually sell a watercolor palette of my own, a custom mix of my favorite colors. You can find the link down in the description below where you can buy it on my website, and also up above I've got a video about it. You know what I don't have in that palette? I don't have a bright red. I do have something like a yellow ochre, not quite, but close. But basically, the Zorn palette, it's opposite day for me. It's the 4 colors that I don't use in my very extensive collection of paints. The Zorn palette was originally developed for oil paints, but since I have painted a grand total of 2 oil paintings in my entire life, I decided to choose a slightly more familiar medium, and so I am painting in gouache paints. I got this really lovely little Zorn palette set from Haraldsdal Paints, which is a small paint maker in Denmark. So Henriette Haraldsdal is an art historian and paint maker who makes gouache paints, sells them on Etsy. Link in the video description down below if you'd like to check out her paints. The Zorn palette is a well-known limited palette that is named after Anders Zorn, who was a Swedish impressionist painter who lived from 1860 to 1920. He painted a lot of portraits and some pastoral and landscape scenes. Many, although not all, of Anders Zorn's paintings were created with this palette of 4 colors. It is pretty cool looking at Anders Zorn's paintings and seeing the range of skin tones he creates, as well as some of the surprising, like, almost greens and almost purples that you can create using yellow ochre and a cool black or a white. These, like, almost greens, almost purples were something that I was very interested and curious about as I started swatching and mixing my paints. This is something where, you know, not all paints are exactly the same, and tiny variations can make a huge difference. The yellow ochre in this Haraldsdal paint set is one of the prettiest versions of yellow ochre that I've seen on its own, but it's very warm. Like, it's a deep golden almost orangey tone. So on first swatch, I was really impressed. I really like this color a lot more than I like those really greenish baby poop yellow, lemony yellow ochres. However, it does mean that because it's more orangey, it can mix some very bright oranges mixed with that red. But whereas I have seen some versions of the Zorn palette where the yellow ochre and the black mix something that's actually kind of green, that's not really the case here. I was pretty impressed with the range of skin tones I could mix. And you'll hear things like, oh, the Zorn palette is all you need to create realistic skin tones, and I do want to put a caveat on some of that. Anders Zorn was a Swedish impressionist painter, and yes, he painted a lot of portraits, but they were mostly portraits of not only Caucasian people, but Caucasian people with a very pale, rosy undertoned skin. For those of us with more of an olive undertone, with some more green to our skin, this would not be as well adapted, and especially I would be concerned with painting darker skin tones, especially because to get any darker, you just have to add black, and that is bound to get those darker tones a little bit more ashy. I finished my mixing chart. I did try to mix some more of the yellow ochre with some black and some white, and trying to see if I could get anything that, if I squinted, looked like a green, and it really wasn't happening for me. So I decided that I would start with painting some portrait studies. So I hopped on over to Line of Action, which is this great website where you can get references for your portraits or do life drawing online without leaving the comfort of your home. This isn't sponsored, they're just a great website. I will leave their link down below. I had it feed me some random portrait references. I'm sorry, my first portrait study here I didn't record most of, which honestly might be for the best, because my goal with this page and my goal with this video is to explore a limited gamut and explore how I can mix these colors. But with this first study, I was really caught up in other challenges, getting used to a different medium. Even just painting portraits is really unfamiliar territory for me, so I spent a lot of time working and reworking proportions and slowly figuring out how to layer gouache, which, again, not really the point of this video, so you didn't miss much. Here's a beautiful portrait. Or it's an alright portrait with a sort of likeness. This first portrait study really did help me get over some of my fears and get into the right mindset, and in particular set my priorities straight in my brain, because I'm not really trying to get necessarily the best likeness and learn all about the proportions of the face here. I am just really trying to understand color. For the second portrait study, I was much more clear on my priorities. I wanted to explore color, and in particular, I wanted to see how I could do with a model with a darker skin tone. I started with a fairly detailed pencil sketch to set up the structure and construction of the face. Although my priority isn't necessarily to get a perfect likeness or even to nail the expression spot on, I really wanted to map out where I was going to have areas of bright light and where I was going to have the deepest shadows. I noticed in my fiddling with the first portrait that I'd gotten some of the tones of the face looking kind of muddy rather than vibrant skin tones. And I knew that this was going to be even more of a problem with a darker skin tone. If I tried to lighten up areas by adding white on top, fortunately for me, my reference did have some very bright lights shining on the subject, so he does have some areas that are in very bright, stark light, and that really helped me build up the structure of his face. Once I was relatively satisfied with my sketch, I painted in the flat gray background first. I thought that having that gray background would help me find the relative colors of his face and upper body and hair more easily. Then I mixed a mid-brown using a bunch of the yellow ochre, a little bit of cadmium red, and just a little bit of black. This color came out just a little bit more golden than the skin tone of the man in my reference, but it was a convincing skin tone for a human, and I didn't want to mix more black in to cool it down because then I was concerned it would start looking more ashy. I mixed a different shade of the same color that did include a little bit more black to apply in the shadows. I watered them down so that I was applying in a fairly transparent way, and then I started blocking in the main shapes that I saw in the face, trying to get my areas of shadow blocked in, while leaving the areas of brightest highlights completely untouched. I painted the inside of the mouth using Ivory Black mixed with varying amounts of the Cadmium Red, more of the red heading down further into the mouth, where the light started hitting my model's tongue. The lips were the same mix, now with an added little bit of white. As I started blocking in the mouth, I realized that I had made a mistake in my initial sketch and that I had placed my model's mouth a little bit too close to his nose compared to the dimensions of my model's face. However, I didn't want to worry about this too much. It's okay that this isn't a perfect likeness. Again, I'm really just working on understanding skin tones as they relate to this Zorn palette. I worked around the face in a sort of jigsaw puzzle sort of way, getting increasingly fine detail and finer contrast as I worked around, trying to bring this face to life. I also painted in my model's chest. I was really pleased with my ability to paint this in a fairly loose and transparent way and just let the paint do its own thing. I found that especially when working with white and black, if I tried to adjust too much in subsequent layers, that I would end up with something that was quite how to say this, like again, like ashy or muddy, and I really wanted to preserve these white highlights. I did find that around my model's nose, in the reference, there was this shining bright light, and I did lose that in trying to create the shadow around his eye and on the far side of his face. I used an acrylic marker to reintroduce those sharpest highlights, but mostly the highlights in this face are primarily just the white of the paper, which is, of course, how I prefer to work in watercolor. It also allows a little bit of the warmth of that paper white, which is warmer than a gouache titanium white. It is worth noting that I did find the white in this gouache set a little bit difficult to re-wet. I mean, I could re-wet it to where I would get a white, but in order to get a very saturated bright white, you need to pick up quite a bit of white pigment. And I found this difficult with this format of gouache where it's in a dried pan. Very convenient for being portable, but I do find that for white specifically, I prefer to have a wet paint if I'm going to be using white to create white highlights. I was concerned that when I added the frown lines in his forehead that I would end up with something looking very blocky or ashy if I mixed it in too much. And I had a little bit of that problem, but I did find that it was pretty easy to just mix in just a little bit and create sort of the impression of having lines from his frown without creating too much of a, blocky Vulcan look. As always, I could see all sorts of little imperfections in this and see where I got my proportions a little bit wrong, or where I could refine some details, but I knew that if I kept on picking at this, that I would just make things look a little bit muddy and overworked. And also, this is a sketchbook, and I had really achieved what I wanted to in terms of exploring color, so I decided to put it down and move on. Looking at my two portraits together, the background in the first portrait, in the reference, it was this sage green, and if I kind of squint and I look at these two portraits, I can almost see that as a sage green. So I started thinking, well, maybe I could use those context clues to create something of a botanical sketch in this painting and create something like, you know, a little bit of something a little bit greenish or a little bit purplish, and we'll see how that goes. I decided to try painting a coneflower study. Coneflowers are in bloom right now. They have these orange anthered cones in the middle, and then they're surrounded by this pale pinky purple petals, and the leaves are a dull grayish green. I thought that this would be kind of perfect for seeing how far I could push this, you know, painting colors that aren't really their idea. Once again, my goal here isn't really to get the most perfect, you know, botanically accurate study. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I did a basic sketch to get my shapes in order, and then I tried painting in the petals first. Since the coolest color in this palette is the black, I mixed a little bit of the red, a little bit of the white, and some black to create something of a maybe verging on purpley pink. It's pretty tenuous as a purple pink, and I tried to paint in the petals. I didn't really get the consistency of paint just right. Again, I'm used to transparent watercolor, and so working in gouache with black and white is still a little unfamiliar to me. Rather than torturing myself over the petals, I figured maybe I'd be able to ground this color better if I worked on the cone next. So using, again, a transparent mix of the cadmium red and the yellow ochre, I painted the basic shape of the cone. In a real coneflower, the main body of the cone is actually a deep, like dark reddish brown black, and it's just those spikes, those pollen anthers, that have that bright orangey color. So then I painted in around the anther shapes to create the main brown black area. Again, I was roughly following the guidelines that I'd drawn before, but I'm not too terribly concerned about getting these all lined up or perfect, because mostly this is just a color study. I tried to create the leaves using a mix of the yellow ochre and ivory black and a tiny bit of white in places. It, again, really was not coming off as green, and the more I looked at this, the less that sage green background on the portrait beside it looked green either. I'm not sure if this is just because the yellow ochre here is a fairly golden version, or whether the other factor might be that in oil, ivory black skews a little bit more blue. I've also seen both cadmium red and alizarin crimson, which is a much more purpley red, mentioned as the red in the Zorn palette. And looking at Zorn's paintings, I suspect he actually frequently used both. Regardless, as a botanical artist, through this whole painting process, from painting my mixing charts to experimenting with portraits to finally this little coneflower study, I kept on thinking of how much fun it would be to do a modified Zorn palette for watercolor, but specifically just make a few tweaks or changes so that it would be a little bit more suitable for painting botanical subjects. I've seen a bunch of watercolor artists adapt the Zorn palette to watercolor, often by replacing the Ivory Black with something of a slightly bluer neutral tint or Payne's Gray, and omitting the white altogether. So if I did that, that would already give me just something that's like hinting at a little bit more of a green. If I also changed the Cadmium Red to a more transparent and more purpley alizarin crimson or alizarin crimson hue, that would also give me a little bit more of an almost purple. And then I started thinking about, well, if I am painting in watercolor and I'm not using a white, what could be the fourth color that I would add to this palette that would be interesting and still keep the spirit of the Zorn palette, but allow me a little bit more flexibility as a botanical artist? And I have a really unconventional choice I'm thinking of. I've had these discussions a little bit in my Discord server, link down in the description below, as well as in my live streams, and I want to know if anyone can guess what the unconventional fourth color that I'm looking at including is. Let me know what your guesses are down in the comments below. I finished out this page with a sort of decorative writing saying this is the Zorn palette featuring Haraldsdal paints. And then because this is gouache and gouache has a tendency of rubbing off on the opposite page in a sketchbook, I decided to seal this painting with some cold wax medium, so you'll see me rubbing that over top. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to hit like. That really helps. If you haven't already, subscribe, ring the bell so that you'll be notified when my next video comes out. Thank you so much for joining, and I'll see you in the next one.